This week we'll be starting a brand new portrait, and like always, this is going to be a multi-part series where I'm going to show you all the techniques that I use from start to finish. The main reason that I painted this one and made this video is just to show you the techniques that I'd use for painting very smooth skin textures. If you watched any of my latest portrait painting tutorials on the channel, you're going to be very familiar with these techniques. But there's a few ways that I'm going to switch it up in this one just to get that effect of a smoother, less textured flesh tone. Up on the left side of the screen is a high resolution photo of my completed painting taken under natural lighting. For this entire painting, I'm only using one airbrush, that's the Krios PS771, and I'm only using one paint, that's black by Schmincke Aero Colors. To reduce the paint, I'm using distilled water here, and the reduction is going to vary throughout this portrait, so I'll be talking about that throughout the video. And finally, the surface that I'm painting on is a clay board. It's 20 by 16 inches. So from here, let's move along to the actual painting. I drew out all of my lines with a 2H pencil, just a light amount of pressure, and what I'm going to do, just like always, is start with the left eye. My completed painting's on the left, so you can see what we're working towards. I'm going to start right in the middle of the eye here by painting in the iris, and what I'm doing is lining up my shield with that lower eyelid and then just spraying a bit of paint above it into that iris, just so I get some separation between the iris and the lower eyelid. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm working on clayboard here instead of a gessoed canvas, and clayboard is very absorbent, especially compared to a gessoed surface. So I was experimenting with over-reduced paint for a lot of this painting, again, just using distilled water to reduce it. So starting out here, I'm working with an over-reduced paint about 60%, so about 4 parts paint to 6 parts distilled water. And to paint in this pupil right in the center of this iris, you'll see that I'm using a circle template here. I found one that fits this circle close enough. I taped off the 2 other edges just to prevent overspray, and I'm just spraying a very light amount of paint into this circle. It's very important that I do not spray too much paint here. I want to keep this very light, and I want to make sure that none of that paint trails underneath the shield. I'm using a soft eraser here. This is the Faber-Castell 7056, just to erase the upper right-hand side of this pupil where the specular highlight is going to be. I'll look for a larger circle that fits the contours of the iris itself, and then I'll line it up and spray some paint in, focusing a bit more toward the edges. Not all the time, but often there's going to be a darker ring around the outer contour of the iris. This is called the limbo ring. Then I'll just come around with another soft eraser just to clean up any overspray. And you can see at this point just how light everything is. I want to make sure that I start slowly, light amount of paint, and I'll build up to those darker values later on. That's what I'm doing here, just continuing with this same paint, spraying more into the pupil to help darken it up, and then I'll just spray some of this paint outside into the iris so I have something there to erase into, just a light even value. Because I sprayed in this paint freehand, there's going to be overspray in the specular highlight up here, so I'll just erase it out with an aggressive eraser. And this one is called the Staedtler Mars Razor. Now in the center of the specular highlight is a small dark dot, because of course the specular highlight is a direct reflection of the light source, so you can see the actual light in her eye here. So I'll use another part of that circle template, line it up, spraying a bit of paint there. This is just kind of mapping in that highlight. From here, I'm going to start some of the textures within the iris itself. The first thing I'm doing is painting in some of the darker areas just outside the pupil. I'm using a ripped piece of paper to help me out here, just lining it up where I want some of these darker rings and spraying in a bit of paint. This way that deckled edge texture just gets transferred over to my panel. I want this to be very subtle, so I'm spraying a very light amount of paint here, and I'm spraying around 15 to 18 psi with this over-reduced paint. What I'm doing here is darkening up the upper part of this iris, and to make it darker, all I need to do is spray more paint. Again, it's very important that I build up these layers slowly so that I don't go too dark too quickly, and I'm just trying to direct these layers of paint up toward the top of this iris, right underneath that upper eyelid. Now, because I don't have anything masked off, there's going to be overspray here, but that's not going to affect me because I'm going to have to darken up those surrounding areas later on anyway. Now moving along to the textures within the iris itself, I'm going to use a few different types of erasers here, and I'm starting first with an aggressive ink eraser. What I'm doing here is erasing out some thin lines that radiate from the outside of the eye right toward the center, toward the pupil. The way that I'm going to approach these textures is just by building them up in layers. What I mean by that is that the highlights that I'm adding in right now are eventually going to get covered up with a thin layer of paint. I'll use a part of that circle template just to mask off the right side and then spray some of of this paint in along to the left. And then once that thin glaze of paint is applied, I'm going to add another layer of erasing right on top of it just to build up some more texture. I'll make sure that I'll use an eraser to remove all of that paint from the specular highlight reflecting the light source. And now as I move along to the left side of this iris, it's a bit too light now, so I'm going to use another part of that shield and just add some more paint here to help darken it up. I'll also build up that value along the top part of the iris where the upper eyelid is just casting a shadow on it. And then just like I did on the right side, some erasing, pulling out some highlights from the outside right into the center toward the pupil. And then at this point I have a fair amount of those textures in, but the value is just very light right now. So later on as I continue the painting, I'm just going to add more paint, more erasing on top, and this is what the final texture of the iris is going to look like. But like always, I'm going to restrain myself. I'm not going to build up to that final dark value or texture just yet. We'll get there. So from here, I want to start getting in some of the surrounding areas painted in. I'm going to start on the upper eyelid, and the first thing I'm doing here is adding in these eyelashes. I'm using a dark graphite pencil first to draw these in. This is a 6B made by Stadler. And then I'll switch right back over to my airbrush, same paint, 60% reduction with distilled water. And I'm going to use a few different shields here, some ripped paper and a freehand shield just to map in the shape of this upper eyelid. I'm going to jump down to the pupil here, add a few more layers of paint just to help darken it up, and then I'll switch over to a freehand shield and line it up with that upper eyelid. I spray a light amount of paint in and then some work with the airbrush freehand just to get that transition point between the sclera and the upper eyelid in. Now I'm going to move along to the left side of this upper eyelid where the eyelashes start, and there's a lot of dark values in here with some very subtle highlights. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just map in the placement of where those eyelashes are just kind of clumped together. Just freehand a light amount of paint down. And that's just going to help me understand where the placement of those eyelashes are going to be. So from here, I'm going to move along to the right side. I'm going to line up my shield just below the tear duct and spray a light amount of paint up. You can see how thin it is. It just helps build some separation there between the eye and the eyelid. I'll use my eraser to remove some paint of where the tear duct is going to be, and then I'm going to switch over to an X-Acto blade. I'll use that X-Acto blade to scratch out a few thin lines along the right side of this upper eyelid. These are going to be a few of the eyelashes that are just catching some light. I want to make sure that I don't use too much pressure on this X-Acto blade because I don't want to cut too deep into the clay board. Just a light amount of pressure to remove a thin amount of paint. Moving back to the left side of this upper eyelid, I'm going to draw in a few more of these eyelashes. I'll just do that with a graphite pencil, and then I'll use the airbrush to spray some of the darker values that I'm seeing here, mainly along the left side. There's going to be a few highlights in here, so I'll first draw them in with an eraser, and then I'll line up a part of a freehand shield on this lower eyelid, spray some paint up a bit more to the left to darken up the left side of the sclera or the whites of the eyes. And then I'll just continue layering some paint along the left side where all those eyelashes are just kind of clumped together. Then I'll go back to that X-Acto blade, scratch out a few hairs here. You can see that it pulls them out very bright, but it's not a big deal because they're going to get darkened up later on. And then I'm just going to continue using those techniques, combining them to draw in the shapes of these eyelashes. You'll see that I'll remove some paint with the eraser, add some more with the airbrush, and then for some of the sharper, darker defined hairs, I will use a black colored pencil. And while I'm doing this, I'm always paying attention to my reference. That's going to guide me as I add in each one of these hairs. From here, I want to get in some of the skin texture just below this eye and that lower eyelid. I'll spray in a light amount of paint just below that lower eyelid and then a bit underneath it where the shadow is. Again, I'm starting out with a very light amount of paint, just trying to get the placement in of everything before going darker. I'll pull out a light amount of paint here on that lower eyelid because it's angled toward the light source and it's just slightly illuminated. It's a bit brighter than the surrounding skin texture. And I noticed that some parts of the sclera were a bit too dark, so I'm going to lighten them up with that eraser. I'll talk about that next, but for now I'm lining up a shield just to get some separation between the lower eyelid and the eye. And then I'll use a graphite pencil to sketch in the placement of the eyelashes on this lower eyelid. They're very light here, so I'm just using a light amount of pressure. I'm going to lighten up the whites of the eyes here just to the left of the iris, and I want to do it without adding any texture. The most common way to do this would be to spray a lighter opaque paint in here like a white to lighten it up. But I'm only using one color for this painting, so I'm going to use a drawing technique of lightly erasing into this paint. It's important that I use a soft eraser for this, and I use a very, very light amount of pressure. So I'm holding that eraser toward the back and just lightly laying the edge of it onto the panel, and then erasing in small circular motions, making sure that they overlap. If I do this and I take my time with it, I can erase out an even layer of paint so it looks like a highlight here. And now I want this to be a bit brighter toward the right side and then get darker as it moves along over to the left. And it's pretty easy to do. On the right side where I want it brighter, I just make a few more passes with the eraser using the same amount of pressure the whole way through. You can see that when I finish that erasing, there's very little texture added in here and it's just a bit brighter on the right side. I'll continue working on that skin texture underneath the eye, just spray some paint in there, and then mainly rendering it with the eraser. There's a few thinner highlights in here, so I just lightly erase them out. Moving along to the skin texture above the eye, I'm going to paint in this crease just by using some freehand shields, lining it up with my curve, and spraying in some paint. That's going to give me a sharp edge along the bottom and a softer edge along the top where it starts to transition into the darker values. I realized it was a bit too light, so I just sprayed it in one more time to help darken it. Before I move up to the eyebrow, I'm just going to make one more pass with that eraser, add some texture in and lighten up some values. I noticed here that some parts of the iris are just a bit too light right now, so I'll need to darken them. I'm switching over to this black paint, spraying it directly from the bottle. And I'll start first in that pupil, spray some paint in there. You can see how much darker it is. And also I'll work a bit along the outside of the iris. From here, I'm going to jump up to the eyebrow. I'm switching back over to a reduced paint around 30% with distilled water. And the first thing I'm doing here is just spraying in a bunch of little lines, some texture for some of the softer hairs and shadows within the background. Then for some separation in between those hairs and some highlights, I use my eraser to pull them out. The lower part of this eyebrow is in a pretty dark shadow, so there's not that much detail here. So what I did was just spray in some paint, just like an even value in there. I'll use my eraser to soften up that transition point between the top part of the eyebrow and where the skin texture is going to be. And then I'll use an X-Acto blade to scratch out some of the thinner, lighter hairs in the center. Now you can see that those highlights from the blade are just way too bright, so I'm going to glaze some paint over the top. That's just going to darken everything up. And then I'll continue with this paint, which is about 30% reduction with distilled water to spray in some of the shadows here right underneath that eyebrow. And you can see that in this area that I was able to get the top part and the lower part darker just by spraying some more paint. And then in the center where some of the highlights are going to be, just sprayed less. I want a lot of the skin textures to be soft and smooth between transitions, so I'm letting that airbrush do the blending for me. There's a small and subtle highlight off to the right side here, so I'm going to switch back over to that soft eraser. I'll start in the center and use the exact same technique that I talked about earlier, just small circular motions. And it's extremely important that I do not apply too much pressure on this eraser because I just want to remove a thin layer of paint. I don't want to remove all of it. And that's going to be it for this eye and the surrounding skin texture. I'm going to stop at this point, and later on when I add in the surrounding flesh tones, I'll come back to this area and adjust it as needed. So on to painting the nose. I'm going to start by painting in a few of the darkest areas first, and as I'm looking at my reference, I notice that's the nostrils. I'll use a freehand shield for this left nostril, just line it up with my drawing, spray a bit of paint down. That gives me the sharp edge that I'm looking for, and then I'll just spray in the rest freehand. I'll focus a bit more of this paint toward the top to darken up that part of the nostril. You'll see in my completed painting that there's a small shadow off to the left side of the nose. I'm lining a part of a freehand shield up that fits that transition point and then spraying a light amount of this black paint over to the left. And this is just going to help get some separation here in between the nose itself and that skin texture over on the left cheek. I want to paint in this cast shadow just below and to the left of the nostril. So I'll go right back over to a freehand shield, line it up on that transition point, and then spray a little bit of paint below it. You'll see that as I'm painting in this nose that I'm switching over to that eraser pretty often. And the reason for this is just to help tighten up the lines and clean up any overspray. For the columella, that area right in between the two nostrils, the shadow at the bottom has kind of a softer edge to it, so I just painted in freehand. If I need to sharpen it up later, I can always come in back with a shield, but for now, this is going to work just fine. And then over to the right nostril, switching off between a bunch of different shields just to paint in that oval shape. That gives me that nice sharp outline, and I could use my eraser here to help sharpen it up a little bit more. The placement of both these nostrils looked pretty good to me, so this is the point where I'm going to start darkening them up. I want to get this really dark, almost pure black value painted into the top of each nostril, because once I get those in, I'm going to use them as reference values to decide how dark I need to go, shading the lower part of the nose. I used another freehand shield to paint in that small shadow along the lower right hand side of the nose. And now I'm going to start applying paint to the lower part of the nose, just kind of shaping it. As I apply paint down here, it's going to make it look like this part of the nose is rounding away from the light source. It's going to help start creating that 3D illusion. And even though that a lot of the values down here are going to need to be very dark, I'll get to that later on. I just want to apply this paint slowly. So this is where I'm going to finish the first part of this video. We got in that left eye and some of the nose. In next week's video, we're just going to continue along. I want to start by just adding some of the subtle skin texture to the nose itself, and then we'll go on to paint that right eye, the lips, and then finally the skin texture of the actual portrait. But before I go, I want to say thank you so much for the incredibly generous support of the channel members. And of course, I'd like to give a shout out and a welcome to the newest channel members. That's Rick, Joby, Javier Art Studios, Shrek, Drazen, Wendell for resubscribing, Tony L, and The Delinquency. Thank you guys all so very much. And I'd also like to thank you, Washington, Ryan from Ryan J Fine Art, and What If We Tried, all for the super thanks over the last few weeks. Thank you guys so very much. We'll pick this one up again next Friday. I hope all of you guys have a great week. All the best in your paintings. I'll see you then.